make sure I hit record. The video for the lab this week is already up on YouTube. You're going to be using Jess Sutton's numbers from what we videoed over the summer. So you can go ahead and use all of her data. Otherwise, we're going to hopefully be able to get data from one of your classmates today that we'll also be able to upload. But obviously, if that's a little too rough for them, then we'll figure out another solution, and that's more than fine. So just keep that in mind for the lab. The lactate lab, because we don't have strips anyways, that is something you're not going to have to worry about. That video for next week is definitely already on YouTube, and that's the one that you're going to go ahead and use. Otherwise, yeah, we're just going to keep humming on along. With that being said, let me get that screen share so you guys can all see what I'm seeing and getting everything situated. So I'm going to be able to see what you guys are putting up in the chat, as well as what you guys are going to be putting up, or who is in the participants. So now, remember guys, once we start working out in the heat, our body can't really send enough blood flow to both our muscle and our skin at the same time. It's going to have to effectively pick, one or the other. So it's more important for the body to effectively make sure the muscles are contracting so you're going to be able to run away. In that it's better to risk heat illness, but to be able to run away from the animal that's trying to kill you than it is to not overregulate, but be caught and devoured. So with that kind of order of operations we have as far as what's a bit more important than the other, you're going to see, obviously, we're going to have issues with thermoregulating. Now, once our body gets over a certain temperature, we're literally going to start to just essentially break down. This is where we're talking about getting into heat stroke and heat exhaustion, which we'll touch on a little bit. And it seems to be a factor no matter what level you are, but if you're a much higher trained individual, you tend to do a better job of rate limiting yourself, of kind of understanding, here's what you can tolerate. And then because of that, you're going to be able to perform a bit better in hot weather, but everybody's going to fall apart in the heat. The key is the untrained and the unadapted way faster. So remember, 80% of our energy loss is going to be mostly due to evaporation when we happen to be exercising. So when it happens to be warm, we have that sense not just in our skin, but remember in our spinal cord and our brain itself. Now we're going to go ahead and try to step up the game for evaporation. And this is using what's known as eccrine sweat glands. And that's also controlled by the preoptic anterior hypothalamus. And this in turn is going to effectively allow us to remove that fluid from the bloodstream and get it to release. Now, the duct's going to reabsorb some of the sodium in the chloride. In fact, sodium, we get better at reabsorbing it as we happen to be training more and more in hot weather. And as we get to go into really heavy sweating, that's where we're going to have a greater amount of loss in general of sodium and chloride, regardless of how well trained we happen to be. Now, in general, what we're going to find is as we train, we're going to do a better job of reabsorbing that sodium and the chloride. Does not work for potassium, calcium, magnesium. So we're still going to have issues of needing to replace those electrolytes, but we're not going to have as much of, when we think about salts and that table salt idea, we're not going to have as much of an issue. Now, we can lose a crazy amount of body water each hour, especially relative to our own body weight. And like anything else, the greater our sweating rate, the lower our blood volume, the lower our overall cardiac output, the higher our heart rate is going to have to work to compensate. So if we happen to go for too long, that's where we're going to run ourselves into issues of potential injury. So if we're looking at the table below, guys, you can see how the total amount of sodium and chloride for someone that happens to be from being untrained to trained, it's going to drastically lower in both genders. So women typically per liter of sweat are actually going to be losing a little bit more of their sodium and chloride. Now, potassium is going to stay the same irregardless of your level of training. Now, like anything else, our body is trying to make sure that we don't hemorrhage too much fluid. So we're going to use a number of different hormones in order for our body to try to regulate what we can. So as we're starting to lose this water and electrolytes are starting to get a little funky, our body's going to release both aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Now, aldosterone is going to tell our kidneys to retain sodium. Now, this retaining of sodium in turn is going to help keep from pushing out as much water at a time, as well as antidiuretic hormone is actually through vasopressin going to make sure that we're not letting go of as much water also through our kidneys into our urine production. So that's why you can be outside working on a hot day all day long and never even have to go to the bathroom. Because you're having fluid losses, obviously, just from the nature of being out in the warm weather, but you are losing that through sweat as opposed to urine. So when we're thinking about just assessing risk when you're going to work out in the heat, well, we need to think about a number of different things. First is how hard are we working out? If we're working out at higher intensity, we're going to be producing more metabolic heat because we're about 75% of the energy that's being essentially released whenever we're breaking down food is just released as heat. Then we need to know what's the air temperature and then what's the humidity. Is there a breeze? So if there is a breeze, it tends to help. When we talk about radiant heat sources, typically we're talking about the sun, but it can obviously be other things that heat is radiating off of, and then the amount of clothing that we happen to be working out within or while we're having to train. So once we have all of these together, we can get an idea of, okay, what's the potential for heat stress? Now, like anything else, we need to keep in mind everything that's going on with the temperature, okay? So that's why we've got not just your dry bulb, which is the air temperature, but wet bulb, which gives you an idea of the temperature difference you're going to get from evaporation. That's why it's in water. Now, globe is going to give us an indicator of effectively the amount of radiation, or so radiant heat. So if obviously that's in direct sunlight, you're going to see this temperature being higher than your dry bulb. Now, once we go ahead and put all of this together, in turn, through this wonderful mathematical equation, we're going to have what is going to be the wet bulb globe temperature. Okay, so we're getting an idea of effectively how much can we use evaporation, radiation, and convection as means to help you go ahead and dissipate heat. And this is why there's certain standards where if the temperature is this level and the humidity is this level, athletes are not allowed to work out outside, specifically using like NCAA guidelines, and other sporting bodies have effectively agreements that like these are the situations where we will not go out because it's effectively too dangerous for our athlete. Now, if we do go out and we do start exercising in the heat, and irregardless if it's not even that hot of a day, if we're not hydrating appropriately, we can get ourselves into 3 different levels of heat illness. The first level is going to be what's known as heat cramps, okay? And this is typically going to be cramping of larger muscle groups, could be your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings, et cetera, that you're going to get from effectively lots and lots of sodium loss, which is throwing off that electrochemical potential, which is causing your muscles to contract when they shouldn't because our gradients aren't as large as they should be. Now, this seems to happen more in people that are heavy sweaters, which is a bit of a genetic component, as well as, remember, when you're training, you're going to sweat less concentrated, but you're going to also sweat more fluid in general, and you're going to start sweating earlier in your workout sessions. And so the way that we're going to avoid this is, well, let's make sure that we've got not just sodium available, but water. And that doesn't mean we necessarily need Gatorade. You can always salt your water, which is not that exciting, but just putting in a little bit, we're not trying to turn salt water, where it becomes a hypertonic solution, and we're not going to be able to take it in the first place. We then have heat exhaustion. Okay, now this is the next level on up, where now we're talking about fatigue, we're dizzy, we can feel nauseous, and we're vomit, and then we're talking about passing out along with your pulse is going to be going wild. Now, this is going to be caused by bigger issues with much greater dehydration thanks to all that sweating. Now, we're not able to match all of the blood flow needs to the muscle and the skin, and typically this is going to be due to low blood volume because we've already sweat out the fluid beforehand. And now we're starting to lose our ability to thermoregulate, partially because we don't have the fluid to call upon to sweat out in the first place. And that would then lead us to what is known as heat stroke. And this is where we can possibly literally die. Once we go high enough, we literally have lost the effect of our hypothalamus to regulate our body temperature. It doesn't work because you are literally baking your brain, for lack of a better term. So that's why you're going to talk about being confused, disoriented, and or just completely passing out. And if this isn't taken care of, if we're not cooling that person down rapidly, you can definitely risk legitimately dying from this situation. So, like anything else, we want to make sure we're making good choices with where we happen to be going out and training our athletes. Keep in mind, how well trained are they? How well habituated, acclimated, acclimatized to the heat are they? Are they well hydrated? Are they making good decisions? Have we practiced previously that day? All of these things are going to compound into potentially causing any of these types of heat injuries or heat illnesses. And like anything else, if your athlete's injured or hurt, well, it turns out they're not going to be able to practice and get better or play for you. So, like anything else, as soon as we're starting to get into some of these issues, we need to do something to rectify it immediately. Easy way to do this is doing a pre-practice and a post-practice weight. So you get an idea of total body water loss, because that's really where all that's coming from, and giving them an idea of like, okay, this is how much you need to replenish with. So you're going to be able to come back, perform again, and not fall apart. Now, like anything else, how are we going to prevent this? Don't work out outside when it's over 28 degrees centigrade through the wet bulb globe thermometer, okay? Or we're going to work out early in the morning, later on the day, never restricting fluid intake. The line from "Remember the Titans of Water makes you weak" is incredibly stupid and a good way to kill athletes. But, it's football. It's not about making great decisions with people's long-term health. And like anything else, we want to make sure we're minimizing the amount of clothing that we're wearing for that practice to the best of our ability. So if we give people fluids, notice how, now, of course, I would prefer not to have my temperature taken in this way, but you're not going to have near as high of a total body temperature when running at a consistent cadence. Notice this is 2 hours. That's a long period of time out there, but like anything else, you can have an issue. Ooh, great question, Courtney. It's not so much that you have to go through each stage. If you're going rapidly enough, but you should have some of those warning signs before you really get into heat exhaustion and then heat stroke. Now, some folks might not really get much heat cramps, but they'll start to feel that confusion, the fatigue, and everything else. Hopefully, the thirst that's going to come with heat exhaustion. And if we don't pick up on those before it goes too far, you can really run yourself into some issues. So, some other good points, okay? Making sure that we are having them replenish fluids based upon that body weight loss. So if we lose 1 kilogram of body weight, we should be drinking 1 liter of water because the density of water is just about 1. So we need to be aware of what are those signs and communicating that to our athletes. And if you're afraid to tell your athletes about what the different symptoms of heat illness and injury are like, and you're afraid then they're going to sandbag it and not work for you, then you should probably just get rid of that athlete. Why even working with them? And if they're not an athlete in the first place, then who cares if they don't want to work hard? If anything, try to make sure they have fun. And this is one of those things where it requires good leadership of being able to say like, hey, this is how things are going to be done. And when we start to have these issues, being mindful about it. And like anything else, sometimes it happens irregardless of how good of a job you do of preparation. Then also to keep in mind contextually, certain, shall we say, positions in certain sports have a much higher likelihood of having issues with heat illness. And so it's important to, keep that in mind. So example, catchers in baseball or softball. Turns out, since you're wearing all that protective gear, which doesn't allow you to use as much radiation not as much convection and evaporation, yes, those are the athletes that are more likely to potentially have this issue. So just keeping in mind, like, okay, here's what the athletes potentially are going to be going through. Here's what maybe the umpires wearing the equipment are going to be going through, and making sure that we're giving, once again, adequate amounts of fluid and breaks when needed. So how do we get used to it? Well, the key is we want to make sure that we're getting exposed to the heat. So acclimation is only going to take about 2 weeks, 9 days to 14 days. Long-term acclimatization, now we're talking about months or years. And acclimation, while we're optimizing our cardiovascular system, we're getting better at sweating. And due to these things, we are going to do better with keeping our core temperature lower during exercise. So we want to start off by taking it easy, just getting outside in that heat, making sure that you are being exposed to it for a couple hours, going and maybe just going for a long walk. So we're getting some metabolic demand, but nothing too much. And then slowly stepping up that exercise intensity while we are being exposed to that temperature as a means to allow the body's physiological systems to upregulate, because we're going to increase that plasma volume. And this can be due to changes in onconic pressure, which that increased fluid volume, once again, gives us more options of what we're going to, or more that we're going to be able to pull from when we're exercising. We're going to see a lower heart rate when we're given the same exercise intensity, and a better cardiac output. So we're going to have better dilation to the skin. We've already talked about how the fluid changes are going to occur, and we're not going to have as big of an issue with losing that sodium. So you're going to see the sweat rate as we're going from essentially day 1 to day 12 is going up. We're going to see that the temperature is not going to be going as high. The highest heart rate is going to be much lower. And overall, when we're looking at an unacclimated versus an acclimated individual, you can see pretty big differences. Now, here's the thing though. In order to get acclimated, you need to be outside and experiencing the temperature. What is the major issue with acclimation for a lot of people? Are most people even acclimated to the temperature they happen to live around? I like the confidence there. Why do you say that? Okay. So whenever we had that ice storm, were you outside for at least 2 hours a day, every single day? So in order to be acclimated, guys, we have to be consistently being exposed to these temperatures. Most people spend most of their day in climate controlled rooms, then getting in a box that is climate controlled, and then getting out of that box, walking outside for a couple steps, and then being inside of other climate controlled rooms. So most people are not well acclimated at all to the actual weather that happens to be in their area, especially when we get to those extremes. So think about in the middle of the summer, like when we're really getting into like the crazy levels of heat. Do you see a lot of people hanging out outside in the middle of the day when it's at its warmest? Actually, do you see that many people outside in general? And then much less in the coldest part of the winter. So a lot of people aren't actually even acclimated to their local environments because they're just not outside that much. They're not undergoing stressful physical activity or otherwise in that type of temperature. Um, so, you know, my wife and I, we live in Lexington. And are you guys familiar with the Liberty Trail? They're building that bridge to, yeah. So construction workers, people that are day laborers outside, absolutely. Yeah, so I walk that trail all the time. From effectively like mid-November until effectively right about now, there's barely anybody walking on that trail, especially when you get into the rough, cold weather. That's the Legacy Trail, and that's on the north side of town. Then we'll have a huge amount of people showing up in April, March, a little bit in June, and then they start disappearing in July and August because it's too hot again and they don't want to be out on that trail. So like anything else, those of us that are out there hiking all the time, like we're acclimated to the temperature. But a lot of other folks are just not experiencing it, so they're not acclimated whatsoever. Now, on the flip side, we've got exercising in the cold. And like anything else, our body is going to do everything it can to try and effectively regulate our temperature by bringing us back up. So when it's cold, we are going to, once again, through the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, we are going to have vasoconstriction, so less blood flow to the skin. We might start to go through non-shivering thermogenesis, so we're increasing our body's natural metabolic rate. And then even further down, now we're going to start about full muscle shivering, where you can actually feel yourself shaking. And this is so that we're going to be able to keep our body temperature up. So I like this figure because you can actually see when we're going into the middle zone where our body's really not that cold. And then as we start to step down, now we're getting much greater vasoconstriction to the skin, non-shivering thermogenesis, and then finally into full shivering. On the flip side, when it comes to now, as we're getting warmer, we've got greater vasodilation, and then we're getting into sweating as ways that we're going to do our best to try to regulate that core temperature between essentially, 30, we're naturally trying to hang out pretty much between 36 and 37 degrees, but we can go up a little bit higher, and that's natural, obviously, when we're exercising. Now, what's interesting is when it says the cerebral cortex triggers behavioral adaptations, that literally means that part of it is we are getting tougher, okay? So if we keep going out in the cold, we're going to have less vasoconstriction, less shivering, and our core temperature is going to be able to go down a little bit more. Now, over a longer period of times, that's where we're going to talk about having some metabolic acclimation. So if we keep going out and out in the cold weather, we're going to have a little bit higher resting metabolic rate. Hence, in a weird way, if you really want to try to lose weight, you can literally try to freeze yourself enough that you're going to be burning more calories. I personally would not suggest it, but like anything else, it is a potential solution. Now, when it comes to insulative acclimation, so when we can't effectively get enough increased metabolism, okay, to deal with the heat loss, then we're going to have even greater amount of vasoconstriction to the skin and potentially increasing our peripheral tissue insulation. So if you really want to help yourself out with the cold, you can always gain more body fat. Not a great long-term strategy. I would not suggest doing that myself. Now, like anything else, if it's too cold, now we're getting into issues with hypothermia and once again, possibly getting some major injuries here. So like anything else, our body comp itself is going to be affecting our heat loss. If we've got a greater amount of muscle or fat tissue, that's going to give us a greater amount of insulation. If we have a lower body surface area to mass ratio, meaning you're longer limbed and spindlier, you are going to, in turn, have a greater amount of heat loss. So if you got a greater amount of mass in general compared to that surface area, well, now you aren't going to have as much heat loss. So once again, if you want to do better in the cold, then you should just try to get as big as possible. In general, children are going to have a slightly higher body surface area to mass ratio than adults, which means literally they are going to have issues with having greater heat loss. Elderly, depending on obviously how you're going into it, potentially. And in general, women tend to do better in the cold than men. And part of it is just due to the way that body fat is held between the two genders and just that, once again, surface area to mass ratio. Since your average male tends to be slightly longer limbed and spindlier than your average female. So just like when we talk about exercising the heat, it's not just the temperature, but it's also the humidity and the wind speed that's going to give us the bigger issues. Now, I understand this table is in Celsius, which makes things a lot more difficult. And notice we don't even bother with until we're in a -10. So -10 Celsius, now we're talking about getting closer to being in the teens of temperature. So this is cold. And you can see you can be in real high winds and, you can have freezing, but it's unlikely. But as soon as we stair step it up a little bit, either the temperature goes down and the wind goes up. Now we're talking about freezing likely in half an hour or over half an hour, less than half an hour, less than 10 minutes. And then notice in the extreme situations, literally less than 3 minutes. So wind chill itself is not, don't think of it as the air movement, but that's just kind of the air temperature. And as it goes by, it increases our amount of convection. And increase our convection, we are going to in turn have a much faster turnover of temperature as we're radiating it out to the environment. So the greater the wind chill, the greater the risk of freezing tissues. And we had a couple legitimately cold days. Nothing that would obviously wreck most people, at least they have a decent amount of gear on, but still enough that was going to obviously make it pretty uncomfortable. So now the other big issue with exercising in the cold is getting wet, because water's thermoconductivity is 26 times greater, meaning you are going to be losing or gaining heat at 26 times the speed. That's why you can have your hand over a range that's 100 degrees, or sorry, like 100 degrees Celsius. So it's literally would be boiling, but you're fine because it's just the air is going to be where it's going to be being effectively convected through. Whereas if you were to go ahead and put or you can stick your hand in the oven when the oven's 300 something degrees, whatever, you're fine. But if you were to stick your hand in a pot of water that was 210 degrees, congratulations, you are now burning the heck out of yourself, because once again, we've got this greater turnover that you're going to have in general. And like anything else, the greater the amount that water is moving, the greater amount of heat loss that you're going to happen to have. So this is why if we're working out in a cold pool or otherwise, or we get wet when we're exercising in the cold, we are going to have some major potential issues with hypothermia. So as you'd expect, or you guys have noticed, when you're really cold, muscle function goes down. You can tell, like when your hands are cold, it's kind of hard to close your hands. Part is because the viscosity in your joints is up a little bit higher because they're colder, but also we're going to have issues with being able to contract all of our muscle fibers and being able to not just contract them for maximal force, but also for speed and power. And as we fatigue, we're not going to be producing as much metabolic heat. And because we're not going to be producing as much metabolic heat, again, we have another risk of getting cold, especially if we're working out in garments that we've now been sweating a lot inside of. And now those are all wet. And if we stop moving, now we're going to have some major potential issues. Now, what's fascinating is also, thanks to that great amount of vasoconstriction to the periphery, as you try to exercise in cold, because you don't have as much blood flow to your subcutaneous fat, you're not actually going to be able to free up as many free fatty acids. So you're actually going to rely much more heavily on muscle glycogen. And in turn, you're going to be going through that glycogen much faster. And we all know once you're out of that glycogen, there goes that energy system, and you are going to be having a real hard time keeping up that output. So hypothermia is going to be when that core temp is going down from about 34.5 to 29.5 centigrades. Once we get below that, we literally completely break down and effectively have no functioning of our POAH, sorry. And we are actually going to have issues with literally starting to lose it. There's people that will paradoxically strip in really cold conditions and be found effectively frozen to death in their underwear because they stop feeling cold. They're literally, their brain is starting to malfunction in this fire because it literally doesn't have enough, it's cold enough that the proteins inside of it aren't functioning like they're supposed to. So in general, this is going to, as we lower our core temperature, it's going to slow down our heart rate. Part of it is going to be because of that wonderful SA nodes not firing as quickly. And cold air itself doesn't really damage ventilatory tissues. It's going to be very uncomfortable because we're trying to get that air to get up to temperature as fast as possible. That's why nasal breathing in the cold can usually make it a little bit easier on you. And some folks can have some kind of cold related asthma. And that is also going to cause a decrement in performance. Typically, you tend to adapt and get a little bit more used to it. Absolutely. It is definitely a burning as it's going through those tissues because they are very sensitive. Think about any time something has gone down the wrong pipe, much less if you ever get water up your nose or something else where you get that burning irregardless. Or for those of you guys that had to do the COVID tests, oh, God, those suck. So, mild hypothermia, bring them in from the cold, give them dry, warm clothes, and warm beverages to increase their core temperature. Now, when we go to severe hypothermia, we need to actually not pump them up too quickly because that SA node is firing at a different rate. If we warm them up too quickly, we can have major issues with arrhythmias. So it's more important to be gradually warming them. And this is one of those things that you should seek medical care. Now, be mindful of why the heck are we working out in conditions where we might risk hypothermia, or working, shall we say, in those conditions. Be mindful of why we're doing these things in the first place and what we can do to make sure that this is not going to be potentially a life-threatening thing for our individuals. And obviously, if one part of the body happens to get too cold, now we're going to get into literally freezing of our peripheral tissues, and it's typically with your fingers and toes because they're the furthest from you. That vasoconstriction causes a lack of blood flow and nutrients in the area, and the tissue is going to die. Now, if this isn't taken care of and literally amputated, now we're talking about gangrene, and that's a rotting. And that is, if you're having a hard time sticking to a diet, Google image gangrene. You're welcome, and I'm sorry. And like anything else, we want to go ahead and rewarm them only if we're not going to risk refreezing. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where you're using this advice, I hope you're going to make it, guys, because this is not a good time. And notice I alluded to earlier, the exercise-induced asthma. It can actually work with a number of folks, and this is because of that more airway drying, thanks to all the air turnover we're having. And you can use beta agonists or different types of steroids to go ahead and give us that vasodilation and still allow us to perform. But like anything else, you've got to be smart. You've got to be careful with what you're doing, and why are we even training in temperature situations that can be a little too hot or too cold. So what questions do you guys have for me right now on the joys of the Katy Perry chapter? Okay. Absolutely, as in hot and cold. Not so much, Colleen. That's going to be more, sorry, it's not so much due to the heat. It's just due to the sheer demands that that individual happens to be going through. Now, obviously, folks that have exercise-induced asthma, it can be due to intensity. It could be due to things like the wonders of pollen and all of the other wonderful, shall we say, components of the air that can be irritants to that individual. So it's about trying to figure out what is the mechanism that's giving them issues and how we can try to work around it. Okay, so I'm going to put you guys into two separate groups. The goal here is to have a little bit of fun. I want you guys to think about what are some ways that you could try to do some basic acclimation to either being in hot weather or cold weather while you're stuck here in Kentucky. So it really seems like we're pretty close to getting into legitimate spring where now, okay, it's not going to be so brutally cold. So, okay, we're not getting into the brutal heat. So let's say you had to travel from here right now and go compete in South America, Africa, Australia, some part of the world that is going to be, we're talking like close to 80, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and also with humidity. What could you do on campus, at your home, and otherwise to try to give you some of the mimicking ideas of exercising the heat without ever obviously traveling to that location? So I want you guys to spitball and think it through. And the opposite way, if you knew you had to get ready to go exercise in the cold and you had to get yourself somewhat ready to be in the cold and exercising, what would you go and do? Where would you try and work out? What would you maybe try to take advantage of? So the goal is hopefully for you guys to think out of the box, to work together, and hopefully we come up with a couple fun ideas. Any questions, comments, concerns before I send you guys into the groups? All right, folks, go ahead and get after it. I will see you guys back. It's 2:00 now. Plan on coming back at 2:10, and then we're going to talk through it and see what we come up with.
We actually had a lot of interesting ideas that I really liked. One that I think Evan talked about was working out at night. That way you'd be losing the radiation heat of the sun, which I thought was like really out of the box and interesting.
Mhm.
One thing that Jessica talked about was having, if you have like a home gym in your garage and the environment around you is like a little cold, you could maybe your garage would already be like a little colder because it doesn't have insulation or anything. And you could use like fans while you work out to kind of get you used to more wind. And then we talked about maybe not acclimation during exercise, but you could take like colder showers and maybe like turn the AC down in your house just so your body would be a little used to kind of like a colder climate
Mhm.
outside of exercise.
Mhm. Nice. No, that's guys exactly that. Trying to think tactically about like, okay, how can I make this place colder than it is? So you could even wear like light cotton clothing and literally take a cold shower and then work out in that because it's gonna be fucking miserable, but it's gonna sink your body temperature and get you a little bit more used to being cold. Some folks have even heard of taking like cold baths, like purposely doing ice baths to kind of get themselves a little bit more habituated or a little bit more used to being in obviously very cold environments and everything else you guys listed. So thinking tactically, so chronologically, it's going to suck for your sleep. But if you want to be exercising in the coldest part of the day, you probably need to go work out at like 2 or 3 in the morning. Ugh. But all of those are potential solutions. You could just be a real jerk to yourself and have an ice bath and just hop in and sit in that in between your sets. Yeah, that also sounds really miserable, but good ideas. Now, on the other idea of, yeah, you could go and try to turn up the temperature and whatever you're trying to work out. Yeah, if saunas were open, you could obviously try to spend more time in them, doing like calisthenics. Obviously, there's Bikram yoga. The entire idea is to be doing yoga in hot environments. So you could have those as potential options. And then I also like your point on working out in layers. So putting on a whole lot of layers, so you're just going to be sweating it out in there. So if you're trying to, you go to the rec center and you show up in full like snow pants and a parka and everything else, like, yeah, you're going to be used to it. No, it's okay, guys. It's okay. Good job, Colleen. Like I said, you guys did a good job of thinking about like, how can I mimic being really cold without actually having to go, you know, to the Arctic tundra? And or how could I mimic trying to be warm? Yeah, one of the more miserable things you can easily do is if you're going back to that garage example, well, if you've got a space heater or you get a couple of them and you just turn that thing into a hot box and you just sweat it out while you're working out inside of there. Or if you only have options with things like going to the rec, okay, well, now I'm going to go work out wearing long underwear, sweats, and everything else on top of it. So I just get used to sweating inside of it. So yeah, good job, guys. Because like anything else, the acclimation is going to take the time it takes. But the sooner we can go and start that process or mimic it, at least to a high level, the better you're going to do, obviously, whenever you get out to those real circumstances. Because obviously, it's not unheard of for athletes here to have to travel down to Florida for a competition. And all they've been used to is good old Kentucky temperatures. And that's going to be really hard. So, any other questions you guys have for me for today? Like I said, the lab versions are going to be online that you guys can follow. Um, Otherwise, we're going to talk through VO2 maxes, their importance, and otherwise on Friday when we see each other in person. And then, yeah, you guys are good to go. So stay safe out there, guys. Sounds great. I'll see you in a few, and we'll get another body testing. Anybody who wants to come and uh, help her test, you come on to the lab immediately. All right, guys, stay safe out there. Bye-bye.